This case study takes place in a middle school after-school program designed to support attendance, homework completion, and social connection for students identified as at risk for disengagement. The program was selected as a single information-rich case because staff reported a persistent pattern. Some students attended consistently and integrated socially, while other students with similar risk indicators attended irregularly or stopped coming. The program also had stable routines, consistent staffing, and detailed participation records, making it a strong setting for studying how belonging is constructed day to day inside one bounded system. The case was bounded by place, time, and activity. The case included the program space used for arrival, group time, homework support, and closing routines, specifically the cafeteria for arrival and snack, 2 adjacent classrooms for homework support, and the library corner used for small group activities. The case covered 1 semester of implementation, from August 26 through December 13. The case included only after-school program sessions and program-related communications. The case did not include students' experiences in regular day classes, unless students referenced them as context for how they interpreted belonging in the after-school program. This case study was designed as a single holistic case study. The bounded program was treated as one case, and the analysis focused on explaining participation patterns within that one program across the semester rather than comparing across multiple programs. The unit of analysis for the explanation was the after-school program as a system, with attention to how students' participation patterns within that system shifted over time in relation to recurring routines and interactions. In other words, the case explanation is explaining how the program's routines and relational conditions produced different participation trajectories inside the program. A typical day in the program followed a stable routine. Students entered the cafeteria for arrival and snack, checked in with staff, and chose a seat while staff handled attendance and announcements. Students then transitioned into a brief group activity, often organized around a short team task or structured discussion prompt. After group time, students moved into homework support in the classrooms, where facilitators circulated to help with assignments, clarify directions, and monitor behavior. The program ended with a closing routine that included reminders, informal checkouts, and dismissal. This stable sequence mattered because belonging signals were delivered through these routines repeatedly, meaning small interactional cues could accumulate across weeks into patterns of engagement or withdrawal. The phenomenon is that some students attend the program consistently, participate fully, and describe a strong sense of belonging, while other students with similar risk factors attend irregularly, withdraw socially, or stop coming altogether. The tension is that program staff often interpret participation as motivation, but students' decisions to engage or disengage may be shaped by subtle experiences of belonging, safety, identity, and peer dynamics that are not visible in attendance counts alone. The consequence is that if the program relies only on surface indicators like attendance and assignment completion, staff may miss the reasons students disconnect, and the program may continue offering supports that are well-intentioned but misaligned with student experience. The existing literature shows that after-school programs can improve academic and behavioral outcomes, and it often uses metrics such as attendance, grades, and completion. Yet studies frequently underexplain how belonging is constructed day to day inside the program, and how students interpret their own participation, especially for students already at risk of disengagement. As a result, the field lacks integrated, context-specific understanding of how belonging is experienced, enacted, and reinforced within an after-school program, and how those experiences relate to patterns of participation over time. Because the missing knowledge is meaning-centered and context-dependent, a qualitative case study design is appropriate. The research problem is that this after-school program shows uneven participation patterns, but staff do not have an evidence-based understanding of how belonging is constructed inside the program, and how those belonging experiences shape whether students attend consistently, inconsistently, or drop out across the semester. The purpose of this qualitative case study was to understand how a sense of belonging was experienced and constructed within one middle school after-school program, and to explain how those belonging experiences related to students' participation patterns over a semester using interviews, observations, and program documents. At the societal level, The missing knowledge matters because after-school programs are one of the few scalable structures communities use to buffer academic risk, supervision gaps, and social isolation for young adolescents. When belonging is misunderstood or treated as secondary, disengagement concentrates among the same students who are already most vulnerable, which compounds inequality over time. Students who repeatedly experience not being expected in supportive spaces are more likely to disengage from school-based opportunities broadly, narrowing pathways to graduation, post-secondary access, and stable employment. Over years, that pattern increases the social and economic costs borne by communities, including higher rates of chronic absenteeism, dropout, underemployment, and involvement with other public systems. In this case, the mechanism that connects the program to those long-run outcomes is not simply attendance as a number. The mechanism is whether youth repeatedly receive membership signals that communicate you are expected here, you are safe to participate here, and you have a place here. When supportive spaces fail to deliver those signals consistently, the same youth most in need of buffering supports are the ones most likely to withdraw. And that withdrawal can compound across settings and years. The theoretical lens for this case study is grounded in belonging as a basic psychological need, aligned with self-determination theory's relatedness need, and in belonging as a socially constructed membership experience shaped by context cues. This draws from self-determination theory associated with Deci and Ryan, and from belonging scholarship that treats belonging as a fundamental human motivation, and as shaped by environments and cues. In this lens, belonging is not only a feeling students carry into the room, it is shaped by whether the environment communicates that the student is noticed, expected, safe to participate, and positioned as a legitimate member of the group. This frame also treats participation as a behavioral trace that often follows belonging signals over time, especially when students are deciding whether returning to a space is worth the social and emotional cost. Using this theory-informed lens, the study began with sensitizing concepts that guided what the researcher looked for during data collection and analysis. The first sensitizing concept was recognition as membership signaling, meaning that greeting, naming, and being expected operate as signals that a student belongs. The second sensitizing concept was psychological safety for help seeking, meaning that students persist when asking for help does not create embarrassment or risk. The third sensitizing concept was peer positioning, meaning that students sustain engagement when they gain a role or place in the peer ecology of the group. These sensitizing concepts were not treated as final answers at the beginning. They were used as theory-informed starting points that the data could confirm, refine, or complicate. These sensitizing concepts also shaped the interview and observation guides by focusing questions and tracking on recognition routines, help-seeking interactions, and peer inclusion or exclusion during core program routines. From these sensitizing concepts, the study articulated theory-informed propositions to guide pattern matching. The first proposition was that recognition routines would function as membership signals, and when recognition was uneven, participation would become less stable. The second proposition was that help-seeking would function as a psychological safety test, and when help-seeking felt risky or shaming, students would withdraw and attend less consistently. The third proposition was that peer positioning would function as a social anchor, and when students lacked a peer role or place, participation would be more fragile over time. The final deliverable of a case study is a detailed case description plus an explanation of how and why the phenomenon happens in that bounded system. In this study, the deliverable is a narrative description of how belonging operates inside this program, paired with an evidence-based explanation that connects belonging routines to participation patterns across the semester. This case study used 3 different types of data as an explicit triangulation plan. 3 sources were necessary because belonging is both an internal experience and a visible interactional pattern, and because participation has a documented trace over time. Interviews captured what belonging meant to students and staff. Observations captured what belonging looked like in real time inside routines and interactions. Documents captured how the program was designed and what participation looked like across weeks. Using all 3 sources made it possible to compare what people said, what happened, and what the program recorded, so conclusions were not based on a single perspective. A simple way to remember multi-source case study is to picture a courtroom. Interviews are witness testimony. Observations are what you directly see happen. And documents are the records. You do not treat any one source as the whole truth. You compare them to see where they confirm each other, where they contradict, and what the pattern means inside the case. Guided by the purpose and research problem, the study addressed the following research question. How is a sense of belonging experienced and constructed within a middle school after-school program? And how does that belonging relate to students' patterns of participation? Participants included 12 students and 5 staff members. Students were selected to represent different patterns of participation, including consistent attendance, inconsistent attendance, and early dropout. Staff participants included the program coordinator, 2 homework support facilitators, and 2 group activity facilitators. Because this was a case study, sampling focused on information-rich participants who could illuminate the phenomenon inside the bounded case, rather than representing a population. Students were invited because their participation patterns could help explain how belonging connected to engagement over time. Participation patterns were defined using the attendance logs across the semester. Consistent attendance was defined as attending at least 75% of program days. Inconsistent attendance was defined as attending between 25 and 75% of program days. Dropout was defined as attending less than 25% of program days, or stopping attendance entirely for the final 4 consecutive weeks of the semester. These thresholds were used to ensure that participation categories were defined by clear evidence in the document data, rather than by informal impressions. The researcher's relationship to the setting was that of an external observer, who was not employed by the program, and did not have authority over student participation, staffing, or discipline. The researcher's stance was that belonging is a powerful driver of engagement, and that stance can shape what the researcher notices. To manage that influence, the researcher used reflexive memos after each observation and after each interview to document assumptions, record surprises, and flag moments where interpretation might be drifting away from what participants described. During observations, the researcher's role was non-instructional. The researcher did not lead activities, did not tutor, and did not evaluate students. The researcher remained in the room, visible but minimally interactive, and redirected students to staff if students attempted to seek help from the researcher. Because simply being present can change behavior, the researcher noted instances when staff or students referenced the observer, changed routines, or performed for the observer, and those moments were considered during interpretation. Interviews were conducted using a semi-structured protocol designed to elicit concrete lived moments rather than general opinions. Student interviews focused on specific sessions, including arrival, group activities, help-seeking, peer interaction, and leaving. Staff interviews focused on how staff recognized belonging, how they responded to disengagement, and what routines they believed mattered most. Student interview questions included: tell me about a day you wanted to come to the program. What happened when you arrived? Tell me about a day you did not want to come. What made it feel that way? Describe a moment you felt included here. Describe a moment you felt left out here. When you need help, what happens and how does that feel? What makes you decide to come back the next day? Staff interview questions included: how do you know when a student feels they belong here? What do you do during arrival to bring students in? What happens when a student is quiet or withdrawn? What routines do you think shape whether students return? How do you interpret irregular attendance? What do you do when a student stops coming? The interview dataset included 12 student interviews, 4 brief follow-up student interviews, and 5 staff interviews. Interviews were audio recorded with permission, lasted approximately 30 to 45 minutes, and were conducted in a private space in the school to reduce peer exposure. Students completed 1 interview each. 4 students completed a brief follow-up interview of 15 to 20 minutes because their participation changed during the semester. Staff completed 1 interview each. Observations followed a structured protocol. The researcher observed the program twice per week for 8 weeks, for a total of 16 sessions. Each observation lasted the full program session, including arrival and snack, transition to group activity, homework support, and closing routines. During each session, the observer tracked the same core elements: who was greeted and how, who initiated interactions, who received adult attention, how adults responded to help seeking, how peers included or excluded one another, and what students did immediately after moments of recognition or correction. Field notes were organized by time-stamped segments so specific interactions could be traced to the routine where they occurred, and each session ended with a short analytic memo capturing emerging patterns and questions to test in later sessions. Documents were collected to capture the program's intended design and participation traces. The document dataset included 16 weekly attendance logs, 1 routine plan, 8 activity guides, 6 communication templates, and 10 incident notes that were relevant to participation and belonging. The most important documents for analysis were the attendance logs, because they showed participation patterns over time, and the routine plan, because it clarified what the program intended to do during arrival, transitions, and help-seeking moments. Ethical protections included consent and assent, privacy safeguards, and clear statements that participation was voluntary and would not affect program access. Parent or guardian consent and student assent were obtained before interviews. Staff consent was obtained before staff interviews. Students were reminded they could skip questions and could stop at any time. Because observations occurred in a group setting where non-participant students could be present, the researcher used an observation privacy boundary. The researcher focused detailed notes on participants and used generalized descriptions for non-participants without identifying details. When a non-participant student became central to an interaction relevant to the case, the researcher recorded the interaction in a de-identified way, describing roles and actions without names, and avoided recording personal information. Attendance logs and program records were de-identified before analysis. Names were removed, and the dataset used participant codes so participation patterns could be analyzed without exposing identity. Any document that contained identifying information was stored securely and separately from the coded dataset. Data management began with creating a case file system. Each participant had a case file containing interview transcripts, relevant observation excerpts, and memos. Observation notes were typed and dated after each session. Documents were cataloged by week and labeled so any excerpt used in analysis could be traced back to its origin. Coding began within each data source using a shared starter codebook aligned to the research question and guided by the sensitizing concepts. The starter codebook included codes such as recognition, invisibility, safe help-seeking, help-shame, peer inclusion, peer exclusion, adult attention, routine predictability, and withdrawal. As coding progressed, the codebook was adapted slightly to fit each source. Interviews used meaning-centered codes capturing feelings and interpretations. Observations used action-centered codes capturing interactional moves. And documents used structural codes capturing routine intentions and participation records. Even with these adaptations, the core code meanings stayed consistent so evidence could be compared across sources. After initial coding, the researcher moved from codes to categories before moving to themes. Codes were the smallest labels attached to specific excerpts, like named greeting, ignored entry, private help, public correction, peer invitation, or peer avoidance. Categories were the next level up, grouping related codes into a shared idea. The category recognition routines grouped codes like named greeting, adult eye contact, expected arrival, and ignored entry. The category help-seeking climate grouped codes like private help, patient explanation, rushed response, and public correction. The category social positioning grouped codes like peer invitation, assigned partner, isolated seating, and peripheral drifting. Themes were built from categories when those categories held together across multiple students and across sources. In plain language, codes are puzzle pieces, categories are small clusters of pieces that clearly belong together, and themes are the major sections of the finished picture. The first pass of coding produced approximately 50 distinct codes across interviews, observations, and documents. After combining overlapping codes and organizing them into categories, the analysis produced 9 categories. Those 9 categories were then synthesized into 3 final themes that best explain participation differences in the case. After initial coding within each source, codes were compared across sources to look for convergence and dissonance. Convergence means multiple sources point to the same pattern. Dissonance means sources conflict, which is treated as evidence that the case is more complex and needs explanation. To merge the three sources explicitly, the researcher used a cross-source matrix. Themes were listed in rows, and evidence from interviews, observations, and documents was listed in columns. For each theme, the matrix captured supporting excerpts from each source when available. The matrix also included a notes column for contradictions, and when contradictions appeared, the researcher returned to the original excerpts to clarify whether the conflict was about different perspectives, different moments in time, or different definitions of belonging. Theme: belonging as recognition. Interview evidence. When they say my name when I walk in, it feels like I'm supposed to be here. Observation evidence. Field notes showed staff greeting a core group by name at arrival while two inconsistent attendees entered without acknowledgement. Document evidence. Attendance logs showed the two students who were repeatedly missed at arrival were among the lowest attendance rates across the semester. To show how the study arrived at findings and interpretation in depth, the analysis moved in 4 deliberate layers. First coding, then patterning, then theme building, then explanation building. In the coding layer, the researcher coded each source line by line or event by event. In interviews, coding tagged meaning statements about belonging, like feeling noticed, feeling safe to ask, feeling embarrassed, or feeling like extra. In observations, coding tagged interactional events, like named greeting, ignored entry, private help, public correction, peer invitation, or peer avoidance. In documents, coding tagged structural traces, like attendance dip after conflict notes, routine changes, or repeated absence patterns. In the patterning layer, the researcher grouped codes into small patterns within each dataset. In interviews, multiple students describing being greeted by name and being expected formed a pattern of recognition. In observations, repeated arrival moments where staff greeted a core group first formed a pattern of uneven recognition. In documents, the clustering of lower attendance among the same students across weeks formed a pattern of uneven participation. In the theme-building layer, patterns were compared across sources, and only patterns that could be traced in more than one source and across multiple students were elevated into themes. A pattern was promoted from a tentative idea to a theme only when 3 conditions were met. It appeared in at least 6 of the 12 student cases. It was supported by at least 2 data sources, and it helped explain participation differences across the attendance categories. In the explanation building layer, themes were not treated as the endpoint. Themes became building blocks for a case explanation that answered how and why participation patterns emerged in this program. The explanation was built by tracing pathways through routine and time. The case narrative was organized in the sequence students experienced the program: arrival, transition into group activity, homework support, and closing. Then it was organized across time, showing how repeated experiences of those routines accumulated across weeks into stable attendance, irregular attendance, or dropout. In this sequencing logic, arrival was treated as the first belonging checkpoint, because recognition happens immediately. Homework support was treated as the second checkpoint, because help seeking can either build safety or create shame. Group activity time was treated as the third checkpoint, because peer position can either anchor students or leave them peripheral. The narrative explanation then connected these checkpoints to the attendance categories by showing how consistent students experience checkpoints as welcoming, while inconsistent and dropout students experience one or more checkpoints as excluding or unpredictable. What counts as description versus interpretation was made explicit. Description is what the data show directly, such as a field note that a student entered and was not greeted, or a quote where a student says they felt invisible, or an attendance record showing a drop in weeks attended. Interpretation is the meaning claim the researcher makes by connecting those descriptions, such as concluding that recognition at arrival functions as a gate to belonging that shapes later participation. Worked examples showing how a finding becomes an interpretation. Raw interview meaning. A student describes feeling like they are not expected because no one says their name at arrival. Observed event pattern. Field notes show the student entering quietly multiple times without being greeted. Document trace. Attendance logs show that students' attendance dropping after several weeks of being missed. Interpretation. In this case, recognition at arrival functions as a belonging gate. When students are not recognized, Their sense of being expected weakens, and participation becomes easier to abandon, which helps explain the shift from inconsistent attendance toward dropout. Worked example for a second theme showing raw data to theme to case explanation. Raw interview meaning. A student describes wanting help but choosing not to ask because asking in front of others feels embarrassing. If it's loud like "you should know this, I don't want to ask again." Observed event pattern. Field notes show a student raising a hand, waiting, then quietly closing their notebook after a brief public correction, and staying silent for the rest of homework time. Document trace. An incident note from the same week records increased conflict during homework support, and a reminder to staff to reduce public callouts. Attendance logs show that several inconsistent attendees missed the next 2 sessions after that high-stress week. Theme. Belonging as safe help seeking, meaning students experience belonging when they can ask for help without shame and disengage when help feels risky. Case explanation link. In this program, homework time becomes a belonging checkpoint. When help seeking is safe, students stay engaged and return. When help seeking is publicly shaming or unpredictable, students protect themselves by withdrawing in the moment, and over time that withdrawal shows up as irregular attendance. A student describes coming to the after-school program more often when they have someone to sit with, and stopping when they feel like an extra. "When I have someone to sit with, I stay. When I don't, I just feel like extra." Field notes show the student entering, scanning for a seat, sitting on the edge of a group, and remaining silent during group activity when no peer invites them in. On a different day, the same student is assigned a partner role during the group task, speaks more, stays through homework time, and jokes with peers at closing. Attendance logs show the students' attendance stabilizing in the weeks after the program introduced structured partner roles during group activities. Before that change, their attendance was irregular. Belonging as peer position means students experience belonging when they have a role or place in the peer ecology, and withdraw when they remain peripheral. In this program, group activity time becomes a belonging checkpoint. When peer roles are clear and inclusive, students become socially anchored and returning is easier. When peer positioning is ambiguous and students remain peripheral, the program becomes socially costly to attend, and over time that cost shows up as irregular attendance and dropout. Negative cases were handled directly. One student described strong belonging in interviews, saying they felt safe and comfortable in the program, but observations showed the student rarely interacted with peers or staff, and often worked alone. Attendance logs showed the student attended consistently despite low interaction. This mismatch led the researcher to revise the meaning of belonging in the case. Belonging was not only social integration. For some students, belonging meant quiet safety, predictable routines, and being allowed to participate without pressure. This negative case expanded the theme boundaries, so the case explanation accounted for both social belonging and safety-based belonging. Some contradictions remained unresolved and were reported transparently. Staff interviews often described help seeking as universally safe because staff believed they used encouraging language, but observations showed that in busy moments some staff responses were brief or impatient. At the same time, several students described help seeking as safe and supportive even on days when observations captured rushed interactions. This contradiction was not forced into a single conclusion. Instead, it was reported as evidence that help-seeking safety may be experienced differently depending on the student, the moment, and the classroom norms the student brings into the space. To strengthen trustworthiness, the study used multiple strategies with concrete logistics. Member checking occurred after preliminary themes were written. Students and staff received a 1-page, plain-language summary of themes and were asked 3 questions. What feels accurate? What feels off? What is missing? Students responded through short written notes or brief check-ins, and staff responded in a short meeting. Peer debriefing occurred through 2 structured meetings where a second reader reviewed coded excerpts and challenged theme boundaries, especially where themes seemed to rely too heavily on one data source. An audit trail was maintained through dated memos documenting coding decisions, matrix revisions, and changes made after negative cases and member feedback, including a record of when a theme name changed, why it changed, and what excerpt triggered that change. Pattern matching was used to connect the theory-informed propositions to the case evidence. The case supported the proposition that recognition routines function as membership signals, because uneven recognition was consistently linked to weaker belonging meaning and less stable attendance. The case supported the proposition that help-seeking functions as a psychological safety test, because moments of public correction were linked to withdrawal during homework time and reduced attendance afterward. The case supported the proposition that peer positioning functions as a social anchor, because students without a peer role described the program as socially costly and were more likely to become irregular, while students given structured roles showed more stable participation. The case also refined the theory by showing that belonging can be constructed through quiet safety and predictable routine, even when peer interaction is minimal, meaning relatedness and membership can be satisfied through protection and predictability, not only through visible social integration. The case also refined the theory by showing that belonging can be constructed through quiet safety and predictable routine, even when peer interaction is minimal, meaning relatedness and membership can be satisfied through protection and predictability, not only through visible social integration. Findings were organized as themes because themes best communicate the repeated meaning structures inside a bounded case. Theme 1 was belonging as recognition. Belonging was experienced when students felt noticed, named, and expected. It was weakened when students felt invisible, especially during arrival and transitions. One student said, "When they say my name when I walk in, it feels like I'm supposed to be here, not just allowed to be here." Theme 2 was belonging as safe help seeking. Belonging increased when students could ask for help without being shamed, and when adults framed mistakes as normal. Belonging decreased when help requests were met with impatience or public correction. One student explained, "If I'm stuck and they come over quiet and just help, I can breathe, but if it's loud like, 'You should know this,' I don't want to ask again." Theme 3 was belonging as peer position. Belonging was shaped by whether students had a role or identity in the group. Students who quickly found a peer partner or role described belonging as easier. Students who were peripheral described belonging as effortful and fragile. One student said, "When I have someone to sit with, I stay. When I don't, I just feel like extra." The final case explanation was built using the cross-source matrix logic and the theory-informed sensitizing concepts. Recognition routines were supported by student accounts of being named, observations of who was greeted and who was missed, and attendance patterns showing that students who were repeatedly missed were more likely to become inconsistent. Safe help seeking was supported by student meaning about comfort and shame, observations of staff responses during help moments, and incident notes showing that conflict and correction clustered on high-stress days. Peer position was supported by student accounts of having a place, observations of who partnered quickly and who stayed peripheral, and attendance patterns showing that peripheral students were more likely to drift. When these membership signals and participation conditions were experienced as welcoming and consistent, participation was more likely to stabilize. When they were experienced as excluding, unpredictable, or risky, participation was more likely to become irregular or end. Because case study aims for analytic generalization rather than statistical generalization, the value of this case is what it suggests about how belonging operates as a set of membership signals within routines that shape engagement over time. Analytic generalization means the explanation transfers to theory, not that the same pattern will occur in every program. Transferability means readers judge whether their setting is similar enough in routines, student needs, and relational conditions for the insights to apply. Limitations included the single program context and the semester timeframe, which means the findings explain how belonging functioned in this specific case, rather than claiming the same structure in all programs. The observer's presence may have influenced behavior, and the case focused on a specific set of routines and spaces, meaning belonging experiences outside those routines may not be captured. Implications included 3 practice moves tied to the themes. Use intentional arrival recognition routines, so every student is greeted by name and expected. Normalize help seeking with private support pathways and affirming language, so help does not increase shame. Create structured peer roles so peripheral students gain a place in the group quickly, while also offering a quiet participation option, so belonging is not dependent on social performance. In plain language, this case study showed that belonging was not an abstract feeling. It was built through repeated moments of recognition, safe help seeking, and peer positioning, and for some students through predictable safety and routine. And when those moments broke down or became excluding, participation became irregular or ended. Here is the research question in plain language and the direct answer. How do students come to feel like they belong in this after-school program? And what happens when they do not? Students came to feel belonging when the program consistently recognized them, made help-seeking feel safe, and gave them a peer position. And when those experiences were missing or inconsistent, students' attendance became irregular or ended. This case study produced a thick description of the program routines, an evidence-based explanation of how belonging signals shape participation over time, a theory-refining insight about belonging as both social membership and quiet safety, and concrete practice implications for designing after-school environments that reduce long-run disengagement. In one sentence, in this after-school program, the phenomenon of uneven participation revealed a tension between what staff could measure and what students experienced. And the consequence of missing those lived belonging signals was continued disengagement. While this case study shows that belonging was constructed through recognition, safe help seeking, and peer positioning across routines, and when those experiences were inconsistent or excluding, participation patterns shifted toward irregular attendance or dropout. This case study approach aligns with established case study methodology that emphasizes bounded systems, multiple sources of evidence, triangulation, and explanation building associated with authors such as Robert Ein and Robert Stake.